Welcome everyone to Monday, the start of a new week. We are also without a camera at the start of this new week because you are listening to me from the past. I am on Sunday time right now, and apparently in this derelict shack I'm staying at this weekend, these creatures don't have a camera. So, fine, whatever. So, what we have for today is checking something we haven't checked in about 14 days, which is the recap of how things have been going in Mythic Plus. Now, this is relevant because this is the start of the week. This is the last week before the release of 10.1.5. So, it's going to be good to go and check how things have been going in Mythic Plus right before we see the changes being brought by 10.1.5, if things are going to change based on the balance tuning that is going to come next reset. So starting with Mythic Plus, we have something we have already checked and noticed in the past few weeks, which has been the growth of Vengeance Demon Hunter as a tank. Now, I am sure most people might not have seen this growth nearly as big as it actually is, because, still, if you go in Mythic Plus, most of the tanks you will likely come across are going to be prot paladins. So you look at this, you look at the top ranking, the top runs, and you see there is a whole bunch of Vengeance Demon Hunters, even also growing a bunch of Guardian Druids, and prot paladins are fewer and fewer, but that is just for the very, very, very top end. So if you're likely still clearing keys in the range of plus 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, even 22, most of those tanks you will still likely see the prot paladin dominance. It's only higher up that you start seeing more and more of these Vengeance and Guardian Druid tanks. That is why, despite the popularity of Prot Paladin still being quite high, if you go and check features like the tier list, the rankings of specs in Mythic Plus, you can see something along these lines, with Vengeance and Guardian above Prot Paladin overall, which is what is shaping up tanks right now. We have talked about this when we made our video about tanks for 10.1.5. We don't have much of any changes planned for both Protection Paladin and Vengeance Demon Hunter. The only one that is bound to change a little bit more and become possibly even stronger is Guardian. So across these popular tanks, the one that might have the higher chance of becoming even stronger at the moment is just Guardian Druid. Same goes for the underplayed tanks like Prot Warrior, even like Brewmaster Monk. Those are not receiving significant changes in 10.1.5, so their chances of becoming more relevant are zero, basically. Now, the situation for healers is a little bit more complicated because it has changed also partially because of which tanks are becoming popular. We have talked about this before. This is the popularity of the healers in the very high levels, and you see there is a couple of standout healers, which are Resto Shaman and Holy Paladin. This is the same as the popularity of Prot Paladin for tanks. When you start going in Mythic Plus in the 18 to 22 or so range, you will still see far more Resto Shamans than Holy Paladins. You will actually also see more Resto Druids and Preservation Evoker, likely, than you will see Holy Paladins. The growth of Holy Paladins is likely just in the very top keys. I mean, if you look at this, when you look at the keys higher than 25, you still see 56 is the number of Holy Paladins present in those keys. Meanwhile, once you scale down the numbers to be in the thousands, in the dozens of thousands, Holy Paladin is still below Shaman and Druid and Evoker, and even below Holy Priest. So, yes, Holy Paladin is growing, but this is not really going to matter for 95, 96, maybe even 98% of the population in Mythic Plus, at the moment, at the very least. We have also talked about this, what is prompting this pivot from Resto Shaman to Holy Paladin in Mythic Plus, what is also changing from Holy Paladin in 10.1.5, the loss of combat res for Prot Paladin, as well as all of the utility brought by Prot Paladin is being patched, is being band-aided by a Holy Paladin instead, who brings the same utility as a Prot Paladin. It was the easiest spec to bring in and replace Prot Paladin compared to a Ret Paladin for the DPS role. Of course, what most of the attention will go for when it comes to healers is going to be Holy Paladin and their rework. A lot will hinge onto what's gonna change there. Now, the stocks at the moment, the rating at the moment still stays on Holy Paladin remaining relevant, mostly because no matter what changes, if Vengeance Demon Hunter remain the meta tanks for the second part of this season, you will still need a combat res, and other classes with combat reses like DKs or Balanced Druids, for example, or Feral Druids are not doing too well. There might be a chance when we go over to Warlocks. Basically, Warlocks Rising might be the only thing that gets Holy Paladin to become less relevant in Mythic Plus, given that Warlocks also have access to a combat res. But for now, the odds are in Holy Paladin remaining the rising healer in 10.1.5, even if the rework is not nearly as strong as it was supposed to be. Then we have the melee DPS, which is perhaps even more deceitful than the other two roles, because we see once more the dominance of Red Paladin, where you see one Red Paladin for every 4 melee players, given their 25% popularity in keys at 20 plus level. Now, the moment you go into 25 plus, so you start seeing the actual top keys, Red Paladin loses out to Rogue, loses out to Warrior, and to Enhancement Shaman as well. But this is, once more, we are talking about like less than 350 players in Mythic Plus right now. It's not really going to affect the majority of the player base. Most people who are doing Mythic Plus right now will still see a majority of Red Paladin players as being the dominant pick in Mythic Plus for melee. We have also talked about the changes coming for 10.1.5 for the melee DPS, which are the fewest. Melees get the fewest amount of changes coming in this patch, so they are the ones who are least likely to change in meta, in popularity, in priority of picks in the next patch, because not really much is being modified for these specs. So you're still likely to see the same specs remaining popular that you are seeing right now, 1 week before the patch releases. Where we might have more surprising changes are for the ranged DPS. At the moment, you all see the popularity of Shadow Priest. Unlike what we said about being deceiving for the previous 3 roles, where Prot Paladin is super popular in 20 plus keys, but once you go into the very high keys, it's Vengeance and Guardian. Red Paladin is super popular in the 20 plus keys, but once you go into the very high keys, it's Rogue, Shaman and Warrior. For healers, it's Resto Shaman and even Druid and Evoker being popular in 20 plus keys, but once you go in the very high keys, it's Holy Paladin. Range DPS are the only ones who stay consistent. The one who is very popular at very high keys is Shadow Priest, and the one who is popular in 20 plus keys is still Shadow Priest. So this is the only role which stays consistent regardless of the key level in terms of popularity of specs. This is also likely not going to change in 10.1.5. Shadow Priest has already been nerfed in its AoE in our latest hotfix in live, so it's not that this nerf is coming in 10.1.5. There are not really nearly enough changes when it comes to specs by themselves in 10.1.5. What we do have are reworks and large changes to some specs, in particular mages and warlocks, and in particular Fire Mage, Frost Mage, Destruction Warlock and Demonology Warlock. Those are the ones that might be highlighted next week with the launch of 10.1.5. Fire Mage was already growing in keys as a mage in the very high key levels. There is another problem in keys right now, where if your tank and if your healer do not bring a Bloodlust, because now tanks don't have access to Bloodlust and healers, it's only Shaman or Evoker. So if your tank is Vengeance or Guardian or whatever and your healer is Holy Paladin, you need one of your DPS players to bring Bloodlust. But if Hunters are not meta, if Elemental Shaman isn't being brought and Resto Shaman isn't being brought, as well as Devastation Evoker not being brought, then all you have left for Bloodlust is Mage. So you can still see, of course, many groups with an Enhancement Shaman, of course, but when the Enhancement Shaman is missing, who is closing the gap, who is bringing the Bloodlust, is generally going to be a mage, and generally a fire mage. Alternatively, but less often, it's going to be a devastation evoker. So with 10.1.5, the mages might be likely to grow more still, especially fire mage. And then there is the other question of warlock. There are some positive changes going for both destruction and demo, and even actually positive changes for affliction. That's why I linked warlocks with the choice of healers. Because what happens if, for example, demo becomes a much more powerful, or even destruction become a much more powerful and meta spec for Mythic Plus? Now suddenly you no longer have a need for a mandatory combat rest in your healer. So now it's no longer mandatory to be bringing in a Holy Paladin. Maybe the rework will be strong enough to want you to keep a Holy Paladin. Maybe the other utility besides the combat rest of Paladin will still be enough to bring a Holy Paladin. But definitely if Warlock were to become much stronger because of these buffs coming in 10.1.5, there might be more choice. There might be more options available in the choice of healers, because now combat rest can also be brought by Warlocks. The last bit for today, as usual, is my favorite bit, which is the most popular comps in Mythic Plus. This is what we have up to this week, this Fortified Incorporeal and Sanguine week, where we see, as usual, the dominance this time is no longer pink, it's purple when it comes to tanks. Healers, as mentioned, are still somewhat varied, because the dominance of Holy Paladin is only in the very high keys. Once you go lower down, you still see the other of the popular healers like Resto Shaman, Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker. The same can be said for DPS, where you still see a decent amount of representation for Ret Paladin. Ret Paladin is still in roughly 50% of the most popular compositions in Mythic Plus. Meanwhile, Shadow Priest is in basically 100% of the most popular compositions in Mythic Plus. Subtlety Rogue is in 80% of the most popular compositions in Mythic Plus. And then we have a few remaining entries of Fire Mage, Enhancement Shaman, Devastation Evoker and Balance Druid. That's the configuration right now for most popular comps in Mythic Plus, which we will then be able to go and check next week and in a couple of weeks after 10.1.5 to see what is changing in terms of popular compositions. So for today, this is what we have as a recap of Mythic Plus right before we get into the new patch, to see what is going to change compared to now, compared to right before the launch of the patch. There are, of course, a few other cool things we will be able to check with the release of the patch, like, for example, the Mega Dungeon and the Time Rifts and whatnot, but for today, we stayed more focused on what's gonna change in Mythic Plus. So, with this last recap of 10.1 when it comes to Mythic Plus, we are leaving each other on this Monday. We are starting, of course, by saying goodbyes to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. You can still support in plenty of other free ways, like liking and commenting down below on this video, of course, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. So, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, no, but really, for real, it's 2023 and you don't have a video camera in your apartment. I mean, you have never been a cam girl, ever? How's that possible?